Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video I want to have a ramble on the buff builds and mostly how they compare and stack up against each other's numbers-wise and also personal experience-wise from my end. As yeah, we have rounded out the three gear set builds that I feel make great buffing builds in the red True Patriot a long time ago, and recently in the red FI and the ongoing directive gear sets. As I've done build showcases on all of them in buffing setups. And together as well, I have quite recently made a folder in the build collection where I have added in some of the buff builds, at this point 4 of them, the red FI, an ongoing directive, a red TP, red True Patriot, and red FI in its more healing way. And I've ranked them basically, they are ranked in that order as well, basically. And I'll be adding intermittently some builds into here, although variations basically on these 3 gear sets, because I feel these 3 are very much preferred ones. As yeah, I feel they can be quite a lot of fun to play for the player that is playing them, and very powerful group-wise, especially in 8-man content, as I've discussed as well in their build showcases. And as always, the build collection itself, the build pictures I'll be showing later on, which are the ones in this folder, and all of my calculation sheets, although it's actually just one of them, will be linked below as always. I'll also try to split it up into some chapters where we'll basically be discussing the builds for a little bit and then going into the numbers for a long bit. So yeah, let's hop in comparing these builds. And to start off, I actually first basically want to introduce the builds, reintroduce them, just so we are on a level playing field. So if you've already seen the build showcases, you might be able to skip this one, although the red TP especially has gotten some improvements since its build showcase, and mostly, yeah, around having an Elmo now, of course, because the Elmo fits in really well with especially the red FI and the red True Patriot, as it adds in a little bit of crit chance to builds that are crit starved, and those two very much were. But it doesn't fit in that cleanly into ongoing directive. So yeah, let's actually jump into the build pictures as I have them prepared here. And if we start off with the red FI, as I have it here, it's just basically as with the build showcase was on it. It is with an Elmo, it is with a Coyote and a Vigilance, so the higher damage setup that is buffing both with FI and with the Coyote. And together with the Elmo, providing a little bit of utility, a secondary weapon with Future Perfect for sneaking in some of them. Healing skills to somewhat heal some dealt chip damage. And it is actually this very much as it is also ranked in order in that buff build recommended folder. I rank this the highest. It is very much a lot more hands-off. It is a little bit dependent on your teammates, where the other two are very much dependent on the player piloting the build, basically. Here, it is very much that your allies need to keep up their armor to get that buff from red FI or from FI. And whenever they take chip damage, their damage goes down, where with the ongoing directive and the True Patriot, you're of course applying marks and flags. So yeah, it's very dependent, I feel, in that way. With good teams, the red FI shines even brighter. With bad teams, it doesn't fall to the levels of the other two really ever, I feel. But it is still, but then it is a little less powerful. And yeah, in its setup, it is very much a strong damage dealer. It outputs decent damage per hit, as shown there. Of course, its buff is also applying to itself, which is a very important thing, making it quite strong. If we then move on to the ongoing directive, which is one of the more recent build showcases, of course, which rounded out the 3, I very much feel that the ongoing directive thing is that it can keep up its personal damage. It can provide a group buff that is minor, that is somewhat not as strong, basically. While in strength, of course, 20% is great. The uptime of it is very low, I feel, even lower than True Patriot. And that is also how I've ranked their group buffs. I've given this one a B tier group buff as its rating. I've given the Red FI that we just saw before S tier, and then the True Patriot a B tier or A tier. So yeah, this basically goes Ongoing Directive as the worst group buff, the True Patriot as the middle ground, and then Red FI or FI as the top top group buff, as has also been basically at this point is the consensus in the community, I feel. But yeah, the Ongoing Directive, especially with Glass, with Sadist, with Vigilance, although you could as well, one thing I didn't touch on in the build showcase, you could go Wicked here as well. The reason I do not is because I feel that Vigilance, that 7% extra, is actually very strong. It is what really brings up the build, and especially in 8-man content, especially in Countdown, where I use this build the most, I feel that you don't get hit as much just because there's more targets for enemies to shoot at. When a wave spawns, usually there's 8 agents for them to shoot at, so you're less likely to be hit. And yeah, this one especially together as well with Sadist, and that basically means that also this can't use Elmo to bring up its crit chances a little bit, but it still lands really well, and its damage output is pretty good, especially if you get a few bleeds going. There's a lot more open to which specializations you want as well, and what skills you want to run. And yeah, you basically play this as a red build, and you try to, as well, in the meantime, try to keep an eye on marking as many things as possible. And that is what I kind of enjoy, especially about the Ongoing Directive and the True Patriots, is that both of them are more dependent on the player piloting the build. So a Red FI is basically more an passive buff, basically, that other players can lose. Here it is basically an active, it is still a buff, and then it has to be applied by the player playing it. And I like that challenge, basically. I like to be more active towards my buffs. And that's why I kind of gravitated somewhat as well towards Ongoing Directive and Red Patriot, more so than I feel a lot of the community. And yeah, so this is the layout as it was shown in the build showcase, and this is also the one that we'll be running most of the numbers on. There was, of course, as well one version with the Ongoing Directive chest and then Coyote, but I feel that one gives up too much damage and basically falls a little way back in the pack. I will actually as well add it to that buff build recommended folder later on, but I feel the thing that the Ongoing Directive build or setup does, the gear set does here in its buffing, is very much that it has high personal damage, and we'll see that in the numbers as well. So if we then move on to the Red Patriot, it has got an upgrade since its build showcase, which is to have a Elmo in it. It has kept, of course, the rest of the setup is the same. I am going for the backpack of True Patriot. And that's mostly because, yeah, I want to take that 8% to 12%. I feel that that 4% is worth giving up a backpack talent, but it then also means that it's falling pretty far behind on personal damage. This one is the lowest on personal damage. But with Elmo, it has, scrapped its way a little bit back up again, and it is basically another buff, is how to think of this one. I feel usually not that I pick this as the first buff. If I were to go into a raid and we were to pick one, I would pick the FI. If we had two, I would pick a FI and a Red Patriot, is the thinking there. Because, yeah, as well with, it has decent damage. It has an Elmo, of course. The Elmo goes to, because it has a magazine size stat on the gear set. You go to 91 rounds with the Elmo, which is quite nice. And buffs the Elmo more than, of course, most other weapons, most other ARs at least. And yeah, it pairs really well with other buff builds, but it can also be run as its own thing. It provides a decent enough buff, 12% on enemies, and it can mark a lot easier, I feel, on the more dangerous enemies. And yeah, it has its own Coyote. Yeah, let's, having discussed these three builds, let's take it over as I've introduced them here, as they will also be named as they are in the spreadsheet, the way that they are in the buff build compare, buff build recommended folder. And let's go discuss some of the numbers, starting out with their personal damage. And here's the spreadsheet I've prepared for today. And it is quite a long one. It is 5 multi-calculators stacked on top of each other all the way down. But we'll go through them, and it is a lot of repeating stuff, although for especially, of course, the different builds for them. But as well, if you do not know these multi-calculators, these are multi-calculators that I've set up, and I've used them quite often. I use them quite often. And what they are is that output happens up here, input happens down here. We have some numbers to test against in-game as well, and we basically get out a burst and a sustained DPS number. There's also a video on my channel that you can go to and watch if you're interested in learning more about how they work and how to input into them for yourself as well, as they'll be linked down below, including this specific sheet. Now, as always, I'll be comparing against these vigilance, this high-end one with glass vigilance threat, obliterate vigilance threat, and unbreakable vigilance threat. And all of the builds here as well are comparing to the number in the top of this column, unless otherwise stated. And actually, with most of the other ones, it will be otherwise stated, but I'll explain those when we get there. And then we can see that if we go on to the FI, the red FI, as it is here, with ranked with a numbering as well. They are in the buff build recommended folder, with the FI first, ongoing directive seconds, and the red patriot as third here. And I've also accounted for all of the stats changes because, of course, for instance, the True Patriot magazine capacity increases, makes changes there. Ongoing directive has a reload speed buff. Some are using Elmos, which has a different RPM, although the same base damage as a FAMAS, which is what the other weapons are using. And I'm even accounting a little bit for a talent on the FAMAS with 9% extra amp basically here, and also with the Striker. And then we can kind of see that compared to those other builds, the FI is actually against the glasses, especially. It is not as high in personal burst damage. Its sustain is decent, mostly because of the Elmo. It is somewhat reaching burst-wise, especially. It is kind of edging towards that Unbreakable Vigilance. And Unbreakable Vigilance is, of course, not the weakest build. It is decent enough. So yeah, it has good. It can kill, basically, is the thing there. That is very much how I set mine up as trying to maximize for this personal damage while keeping enough of the buff. Because, of course, we could, for instance, put glass on it or something, but then we would lose the chest talent for FI. So there is a balance to be sought there, and I feel that I've gotten a decent balance through playing them as well and testing them out. And what I feel now that I have in the buff build recommended folder, I feel are very much my recommendations of how to run these builds. If we then move on to the ongoing directive, we can see that the ongoing directive is actually doing really well for itself on personal damage, but then of course it is doing worse on its group buff. Its 20% is very strong, of course, but its uptime, especially on others, is very low. While on yourself you get a full mag, all of your allies get half of their magazine size, and most of them will have either, nowadays, of course, likely an Elmo in their hands, which gives them 35 rounds. But in the past, especially, they would get 25 rounds from a 50-round AR. And that kind of cuts in its strength. Because, for instance, I have in the long past, played having recruited basically a clan to help me for some testing-wise, where we went in with everybody having GR9s with Sadist, and with the ongoing directive together. And suddenly, of course, the strength of that buff went up immensely, because all of a sudden, instead of having 25 rounds per kill, they were getting 100 rounds each time a marked enemy died. They had all had sadist on their weapon, which is of course a very strong talent, and also the reason as well, if you're wondering why here suddenly, while in the showcase, the ongoing directive glass was behind glass vigilance red, but here it is ahead umbers. That is because the high end red and the striker is running strained as its weapon talent, but of course the ongoing directive gets to have sadist, which is 10%, which is basically 11% more calculation wise, because it is a straight up 20% amp. That sadist, and that is very strong. That is incredibly strong. Basically, like having a king breaker versus having normal talent. If we then go to the red patriot, as I have it here, we can see that it is the lowest personal damage. It is, I feel, in between the other two for its group buff, and especially because on things like raid bosses and such, it can have close to perfect uptime on its debuff, and that's kind of what the Red Patriot's niche is, where the ongoing directive very much the Redify is the all-rounder. The ongoing directive has good personal damage and needs to be piloted by the player to apply that damage and the marks. The Red Patriot can have very high uptime on that buff, higher I feel than any of the others, although of course it's weaker at 12%. But it can have close to perfect uptime on certain things. So not everything, not when you're running around in Countdown or something, but for instance, raid bosses where there is one big enemy that needs to die, you can have perfect uptime, basically. And that is its niche in that way. We can see, yeah, that it's very low actually on its personal damage, and that makes sense, of course. It is basically the FI, but then without with basically 13% total weapon damage less. One thing as well that I briefly wanted to show, if I take you in game with the Red Patriot as I have it here. Ran a little bit of a Coney here on story mode just for testing purposes here. And just to show this especially is that if you look at my ammo, I have 91 shock rounds. And that is because the Elmo, its wording as well, is that at 100 sacks, the next magazine will be filled with shock ammo. It doesn't say 70 rounds, it says the next magazine. And because we are increasing the magazine size, of course, with the 3-piece of True Patriot, we get 20 more shock rounds. Now, of course, this is just trivia. This isn't really a practical thing. Doesn't really matter. 20 extra shock rounds isn't going to change anything. But I just wanted to show it because I know a lot of people will not know that. So yeah, let's go back to our numbers and make them much larger than I have them there. But yeah, so yeah, the Red Patriot, it has the middle of the road on group buff and then has the worst personal damage, basically. Now, if we move on, as if I scroll down, we can see here, which is also what I did with the Red FI and ongoing directive spreadsheets, is to have what does it add group-wise? What happens if we have 8 Obliterate Strikers versus having 7 Obliterate Strikers with one of each of the builds, as we have it here. And I've, of course, accounted as well, again, for all of the discrepancies in RPM and such. So, and here we're combining them back together, basically. So it's basically going 8 Obliterate Strikers, and that's their number at the top there. And then it's coming back with 7 plus Edify, and then combining them back together to get the number at the bottom of before it becomes the second gray part. And the second gray part is actually one of those places where I've split this up into basically 2 multi-calculators. And the percentages on the second part and the gray part, in the like darker gray part, are a second set, and they're comparing to that build at the top. But here we can already see that if we go from 8 Obliterate Strikers to just 7 Obliterate Strikers with the FI buff, although with a caveat that this is considering basically perfect uptime, which of course doesn't happen. People will take chip damage and will go down, and it's very reliant on your team members. If you're playing with players that kind of are set up or know how to play alongside a FI, for instance, they put on a shield, or for instance, there's a player with Vanguard, for instance, in IH, and is providing that Vanguard buff really well and keeping a high uptime on it, keeping it so that no one's taking chip damage to lose the FI buff, then you can have more uptime. And then in challenging with maybe a lot of low-level players around you, they might be like headless chickens running into every chip damage that they can take, and then you have basically no uptime. So it is very reliant on your teammates, the FI buff. And that's also the thing. There is no way to really quantify what this uptime is. One thing I have added is at the right side here, although I won't be using it till the last one because I don't want to make this too long, which one of my previous takes at this is if you make a copy of this and want to play around with this in your own Google Drive, these active percentages, you can alter them to have different active amounts basically of the buff. So if you think that it's only going to be active for 33%, you can add that in, and then it will change the numbers to reflect that. And yeah, we can see then that the 7 Obliterate Strikers are actually stronger than 8 with if they have perfect uptime basically. And then the FI, of course, itself adds itself in with its damage, and then it takes it, although quite low in comparison, especially to strikers. It is altogether, it is a benefit to run the FI, and I feel even if you are basically very low on the uptime, even it is still worthwhile to run the FI. And if we then move on to the ongoing directive, which has less uptime on its buff, really, but it makes kind of up for it because it has its own personal damage so much higher than the other one. And yeah, basically the second section is comparing to this 8 Obliterate Strikers, which is the same 8 Obliterate Strikers, really, but just for comparison's sake, it's split up like that. And then yeah, 7 of them as well land on exactly the same number as the FI, and that's very much down to because that FI buff is of course 25 total weapon damage. On the builds that I've chosen, they already had 25 from Obliterate being at full blast basically, and what happens there then is that those two together, the actual increase from that going from 25 to 50 from Obliterate to Obliterate plus the FI buff is 20% in this calculation sake. And of course, the ongoing directive buff is also 20%, but in the AMP category. So they land up as basically the same number added in. But of course, the uptime on ongoing is, I feel, the worst. It is the worst of the 3 on its uptime. But it makes up a little bit for it in its own personal damage, and it is more reliant on the player playing it, which I find quite enjoyable to try to have as playing it to maximize my damage output, and also keeping an eye on marking as much stuff as I can to have as many bullets go to my allies, basically. And that's kind of the thing that I feel the ongoing directive one does. It is high personal damage. You still feel like you're really contributing, and you're playing basically a red build, and you're trying to do even more than just playing the red build and trying to have awareness up on where enemies are spawning, trying to mark them, trying to mark multiple things, while also not wasting too much time in running in between targets and such. So that is what the ongoing directive kind of does for me. And yeah, back together of them together is much higher, of course, than the FI, while the 7 buffed strikers are the same amount, just because the ongoing itself adds in more personal damage into it. It lands actually higher. But then, of course, yeah, with lower uptime, the ongoing directive will likely actually, in actual play, will land a lot lower group total-wise than the FI, I feel. If we then move on to a third one here, which is then, of course, the one remaining one, which is the True Patriot, which also didn't get this spreadsheet, of course, as it was one of my earliest build showcases. I think even my first build showcase. I didn't do these numbers back then like this. So if we add in the True Patriot buff at full extent as always being active, we can see that actually going from in this case, from those 8 Obliterate Strikers to this 7, we actually are losing damage when we are comparing 7 Obliterate Strikers to 8. So we are 1 man down, basically. If we then add in the Red Patriots, pretty low personal damage, we land on just being above it. But the important thing to remember here is that the Red Patriot, on some occasions, for instance, on Buddy and Lucy, to name one, or on especially, for instance, the damage on Boomer itself, if your team was very low on damage, or yeah, all of the raid bosses, basically, it can basically have perfect uptime on them. So this one is the most achievable of the theoretical numbers that I'm giving here. And that is actually its thing. It has a really high uptime on a somewhat weaker buff. Where FI has a much stronger buff that has lower uptime. Although I should say debuff in the case of the True Patriot, because it's applying it to the enemy. And yeah, that is kind of the thing that the Red Patriot can do. Is I feel, especially in raids, I kind of enjoy it because it still has enough damage, for instance, to help hold a circle in Razorback. But then also, well, nowadays, of course, a lot of people do cheesy methods on Razorback. But back then, when we didn't know them yet, or for groups as well that are just doing them normally, then this kind of stuff kind of helps, just because group-wise, you just land up a little bit higher. And of course, this is as well, if these were glass reds, this last percentage would be higher, because in comparison to them, the Red Patriot is adding in more than them. It is mostly this low nowadays because we're comparing with Obliterate Strikers, which are very high damage builds, higher than we have had at any point except for Heartbreaker. Now, if we move on to having all 3 builds basically in one group, so we've gone down to, and we're still comparing actually to the top numbers here, even though this is grayed out. We are adding 5 Obliterate Strikers and 1 of each buffing build, and all of them at full effectiveness, 100% uptime. We can see that even at that point, 5 Obliterate Strikers, by having all of those group buffs from the other ones, although at perfect uptime, so this is completely theoretical at this point. We can see 5 Obliterate Strikers are doing the damage of 8 Obliterate Strikers that aren't buffed at all. And that's kind of impressive that the buffs are adding in so much. And here I also kind of want to discuss that it's actually quite useful to add in buffs to allies, especially the red FI buff, which is a lot more passive to allies, because they will kill the target that they're aiming at. And this is more of a tactics part of this. They will kill their personal target that they're aiming at faster, meaning they will move on to more targets and converge basically on the enemies in front of them. And that is actually a thing that happens, especially in other games. For instance, for those that have played EVE, where you have a fleet leader that basically calls out specific targets that everybody attacks, and by taking down targets, basically getting the numbers of the enemies down, you basically cascade a lot faster. So if you can kill a little bit faster, especially people, for instance, in Countdown, you might not have the entire team engaging some enemies, but just a few people over here engaging 2 enemies over here, 3 people over here engaging some enemies over there. Having the ability to free them up faster with a group buff is actually cascades a lot. It makes it so that the group that kills their enemies faster can start moving towards the bigger enemies, start working together with them. And that is actually quite a strong thing that just naturally happens when there is a little bit more power, especially. For instance, when strikers started coming in, this was quite noticeable, that stuff was dying a little bit faster. And it wasn't just that the damage was going higher, but people were converging on targets faster and killing because of that a lot faster and clearing faster. And yeah, especially with 3 buffers, buffing 5, these 5 can basically streamroll through a lot of stuff. And of course, then we still have to add in all 3 builds because they still have their personal damage. They are still shooting as well. And if we add it all together, we basically are adding 17% to the entire team. And because two of them are also running Elmos, 21% in sustain. So our upper bound is so much higher. Now, of course, this is theoretical. This is all of them with perfect uptime. But towards the end here, later on, we'll actually put them to lower uptimes and see what this numbers lands on. But this just as just to convey, especially how much buffing can help other builds to catch up to at 5 against 8. So that was quite impressive, and I was actually quite impressed by that number, as I hadn't done this specific calculations to this extent, especially putting multiples of them together. I hadn't done that before. If we then move on to here, we have basically doubles. So we have at the top 8 and then 6 plus 2 of the builds. And of course, we have 3 combinations. So we're going to go through all of them just briefly, just fast, basically. And especially the combination that I like the most is, well, it depends on the situation, but for countdown, especially a red FI and ongoing. And then for raid, especially, I quite enjoy having a red FI and a red Patriot together. As I said, the uptime, especially on raid bosses for the true Patriot, is very high. So all of the combinations kind of make sense, although I wouldn't personally pick a red ongoing together with a red true Patriot because they don't have basically much overlap. One of them is trying to have enemies that stay alive very long, and the other is trying, or well, need some time to be killed, basically. And the other is very much trying to kill as many things. And the two of them don't match well, I feel. Now, if we go with, that first combination that I said for especially raids, with the FI together with the red Patriot, we can see that, this 113%, as we, for instance, go back up and just look at the FI, we're gaining a few percentage points, but the uptime difference between the two, if I line this back up again, the uptime difference between the two is, of course, very, very stark, with the True Patriot having actually a lot more uptime. So more of this buff is coming from the True Patriot at that point. But it still means that basically 6 strikers are, if perfect uptime, of course, again, are basically the same as 8 strikers, just from those 2 group buffs being on them. And of course, for instance, with, as I said, some raid bosses, you can have this basically happen, having no chip damage taken because, for instance, a Vanguard goes up because IH1 and 2 basically, or well, IH2 mostly, boss fight. And of course, the True Patriot has flags up on the boss continuously. And then you can basically hit this number. So that's actually kind of cool of the two. And you can see that it is basically 13% more damage than just having all of them be strikers. Although, of course, we don't take strikers in the raids, but I'm just using their numbers here, really. Although, of course, well, we do take strikers in the raid, but it's not the initial recommended. We usually recommend high-end reds because they have more upfront damage. This is, of course, all of the strikers in all of these calculations are at full blast at all time, fully stacked, which they aren't, of course. They lose their stacks and have to stack back up. And then if we go to the FI plus ongoing directive combination, which I feel is really good for countdown, especially, we can see that, that group, both of those very much stronger group buffs, although both of them with less uptime, or well, I would say, both of them with less uptime than the True Patriot in a raid setting, at least. We're landing on a pretty high number of 123% total, especially because also the ongoing directive is keeping up its damage itself. And both buffs are some of the stronger numerical ones. And this is really the reason why I feel the buffing builds really do make sense, as I've also said in the showcases. And they really have a place in buffing others, as we also get that cascading effect and such. Now, if we move on to the last set, which of course only leaves ongoing directive together with Red Patriot, we can see that combination as well kind of works. It lands together at a decent 8% increase on burst for both teams, but just playstyle wise, these two don't match up well together, and I don't feel that there's many situations where they like mesh well. Because yeah, one of them is trying to kill as many small enemies basically, and the other is trying to have big enemies that take long to kill, which for instance in some boss arenas and stuff happens, or when a name spawns in heroic countdown, it can kind of happen. But I feel that, yeah, FI, having an FI first, basically, is the way that I usually go. But yeah, both of them having, especially the ongoing again here, having its own personal damage be quite high means that even those 6 obliterate strikers are, of course, reaching decent close numbers with against 8 strikers. So yeah, that buff is those buffs are working quite well. It lands up on a decent enough number to still be considered, basically. And of course, for a lot of us, we'll take these into matchmaking. We want to know what other people have. But just having the buffing builds, and also one of the things I wanted to say then as well is, yeah, of course, the FI buffs don't stack. So having one person has them, that's enough for the entire team. Having a second one doesn't really help. And that's usually what I have as well. For instance, my character that has the ongoing directive gear set version, the glass one, that's the same character that has the red FI. So if I see an FI, either as a healer version or the red FI when I'm inspecting people once I joined Countdown, if there is one, I'll swap to ongoing and then use that if I want to stick to a buffing build, or I'll swap to a high damage build and enjoy their buff as they're providing it. But yeah, all these combinations work really well, and we'll end up here as well with the buffs at. We're still comparing basically against these top numbers with this last final part, which is that 8 obliterate striker. But here I have set the buff activeness for all 3 of the gear sets at 50%. So all of the numbers that they provide to other builds and themselves have been decreased to half, basically, meaning that yeah, this is one of those things that you can kind of play around it. Although, of course, we don't have really metrics for this. No metric for this can really exist. Basically, it is so dependent on what content you're doing, what players you are with. So, but it is a fun thing to play around with, and I've played around with it a lot. I've landed up in this 50%-ish one here. And if we then look at our group total, we can see that it's actually lower. But what I then want to add in, of course, is if the ongoing players and stuff are keeping, especially the bleed rounds going for quite well, if the TP is, for instance, of course, here we have all 3 builds as well in there, which there is basically a tipping point of having too many buff builds and not enough people, strong builds getting buffed, which is kind of what is happening here. Just because Striker is so much higher in its damage output, 5 buffed strikers at having less of those strong buffs, because also stat-wise the buffs are less than basically what the amp, especially of the gear set of Striker, is with the backpack by quite a large margin. But for instance, if this was with the reds, it would still land in the positive here, because we're with high-end reds. I mean, with obliterate here, it is falling behind. But you still have to consider that damage-wise, so here we're kind of considering it as half active all the time. Damage-wise, it is still valuable for strong players to buff them, basically have them kill their target in front of them faster, freeing them up to move to the next target. And that very much is also one thing to consider, as there are many things of these kinds to consider quite often. Just numbers usually don't tell the whole story. And it's very much how they are interpreted as well, because of course we could consider the 100% uptime ones as gospel, but I wouldn't consider those. But yeah, just to give a little bit of insight into these numbers, because I can't give you final numbers on this, of course, but you, if you are interested, can make a copy of the spreadsheet, play around, especially with the other ones, with their active percentages as well. As I said, those can be quite interesting, if you especially have some ideas of your own of how active you feel they are. And of course, as well, the buff build recommended folder is now active and can be used to share some of the builds and stuff. And I'll be adding in more as more variants. Although, of course, this of these 3 gear sets basically, was this is the 3 gear sets that do it. But I'll be adding in more variants, especially, for instance, the ongoing directive with the chest, as I showed in the showcase. Maybe some other variants as well with red FI, with having vigilance plus BTSU, which I don't have here currently. And yeah, those will be added in more and more as I make them. If we then move on to concluding. As I hope this wasn't too long and too boring of a spreadsheet, but yeah, this, as I said at the start, this very much was going to be a spreadsheet video. But yeah, I really wanted to make this just to give a little bit of my ideas on the buff builds, to round them out basically as we had done all 3. I have reworked this video several times basically because it was even longer with more spreadsheets, and even I reached my limit a little bit in talking about them, even though, of course, this still is quite a long video. And yeah, for my next video, I will actually... one of 2 things will be the next video. One is either I'm going to be talking about the range and how, in what ways it breaks and in what ways we can't really use it, as quite often I still see people using the range in ways that isn't great. And also I'm going to do the second part of the high-end red glass thought process, because we did that, or I did that about more than a month ago at this point, and I should revisit that and finish that off. That was quite an interesting thing to go through. So I hope you join me for those, or on Twitch, where I quite often run these builds in countdowns. And have a good night.